With just a few weeks to go in the 2025 legislative session, there's still plenty of work to be done. Issues like housing, workers' comp, and education are at the forefront of municipal leaders' minds. CCM's crack policy team is working around the clock, reading bills, holding meetings with legislators, and hearing from CCM's municipal members. Joining us today is Brian O'Connor and Randy Collins, Director and Deputy Director of Public Policy and Advocacy, to talk us through the final days of the session and discuss what is on the table for our towns and cities. The Municipal Voice is a Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum in important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or a member of municipal leaders. Brian, Randy, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be back.
Yeah, so we're coming towards the end of the session here, which is why we're having you on right now to kind of give us where we're at as we're closing in on the end here. So, Brian, I'll start you off. What's going on right now? What's kind of the headline news?
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Matt. I'd say right now, there are a couple of things that I want to alert your viewership with is we just passed a major workers' comp reform bill. It was in light of a Supreme Court decision in Connecticut that we, for lack of a better term, called Gardner. That was the main individual involved with the case's name. But basically what it did is it would have reverted back to 1993 workers' comp laws, or actually pre-1993.
Okay.
The last time there was a major reform, which would have exposed municipalities to, I think it was estimated to be like 240% increases potentially in their premium. So we were able to kind of work through that. There was negotiations not only with the Trial Lawyers Association, but also with the unions. And we were able to come up with a proposal that was voted on yesterday by both the House and Senate, and we anticipate will be signed by the governor.
Okay.
That will at least make premiums more predictable going forward, and limits our exposure.
So is that when we're calling that a win? That's good for us. Good news.
That's very good for us.
Okay.
Yeah. The alternative would have been horrible. One community would have seen their premiums increase by $3.6 million, and that's just the premiums. That's not awards or other payments.
So we dodged one on that. Right?
Yes.
Hey, Randy, what's keeping you up at night right now?
What's keeping me up at night right now is the budget. We're really this is a budget year. So we're very much looking at where can we provide additional aid to municipalities. The legislature is really constrained by the constitutional the fiscal guardrails that limit spending, which I think is very frustrating because we're looking at either a record surplus they're projecting a record surplus or a near record budget surplus for almost the sixth or seventh year in a row. The state's budget reserve fund is now in excess of $4 billion.
So the rainy day fund is chock full.
And so they're actually looking to change the statutory cap on that to actually deposit another billion to bring it up over $5 billion. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of towns that are going through revaluations, which they're required to do every 5 years. And we're seeing a significant shift from commercial value to residential value, which is really putting a strain on residential property taxes. And we're screaming for relief wherever the legislature can assist.
Yeah. So, Brian, what are some of the forms of relief that we're looking maybe to get?
One of the things we're proactive on is education. We did see a substantial increase within the appropriations budget on the excess cost grant. We're still looking at, seeing what we might be able to do with the foundation grant. I think that's one of the key issues going forward. It hasn't been updated since 2013. We're also looking at potentially seeing if we can add a weight for special education or students with disabilities and add that to the ECS formula. It's a little trickier than I think people originally thought it might
Yeah.
be, but we're still trying to work through that. And, so that's an area that will provide immediate relief
Hmm.
to municipalities that will at least uh, help offset some of the costs for special ed, which is probably
Yeah.
one of the drivers of recent property tax increases, is the increase in special education funding.
Yeah, I know on the communication side, we've had this push recently called "Do the Math." Is this kind of tied into the same issues of
Very much so.
asking the governor and the Senate and everybody to like look at the numbers? And part of our thing with this is that these mandates and these cuts into education, they're going to end up driving up property taxes, right?
Yep. I mean, as we're confined, I mean, we are confined to property tax revenue and state aid, which, um, well, state aid, I think, has been consistent over the
Hmm.
last few years, which, you know, when we look back not too long ago, when we were in consistent budget deficits,
Yeah.
that wasn't the case. But, in light of, you know, special, record surplus year after year,
Hmm.
having consistent state aid has not been keeping pace with just our everyday costs that are going up, that
Hmm.
we're getting the same amount of revenue, yet every single thing that we are, insurance, energy costs, fuel costs, all of those continue to rise. Labor costs, health insurance,
Yeah.
continuing to rise. And how are we keeping pace with that? And I think that's really where the problem
So it's
is.
been steady, but the costs have not.
Yeah. So even beyond the straight additional funding, I mean, even with the budget that passed out of a probes,
Hmm.
um, certainly we didn't see a lot of relief in terms of additional aid, additional funding for payment in lieu of taxes. That's for
Hmm.
money we're supposed to receive in lieu of where we have property taxes are exempt.
So
Um,
universities, hospitals, churches, stuff like that.
State properties, exactly. So that remains steady. So we didn't see a lot of additional aid. So we are working with the legislature and looking for ways, other avenues to provide
Hmm.
property tax relief, to provide additional aid to municipalities. We're looking to get a little bit of relief with motor vehicle revenue.
Hmm.
When towns that are going through these revals are forced to come down on their mill rates to protect their property taxpayers,
Hmm.
because you're seeing literally, residential property. It, you know, I know Weathersfield just came through, and some people were saying that their properties increased by more than 46%.
Wow.
Um, so towns are lowering their mill rates, but that also reduces the motor vehicle reimbursement based on the cap that the legislature passed. And we're
Mm.
looking to say, instead of having it, that no, those numbers fall off immediately, reduce them almost at a phase down over a 5-year period to ease that sticker shock a little bit.
Yeah.
The
Yeah, I know car
appropriate,
taxes is kind of one we talk about year after year, and there's always talk about getting rid of them. But the
there is a bill.
consequences of that, you got to think of first before you do it, and it's kind of one of these issues
Yeah,
that comes up in some form all the time.
yeah, there's another bill that came out this year, out of the finance committee, that would eliminate set in motion a plan to eliminate the car tax.
Yeah,
Um, there is within the bill, there is a plan that would offset the municipal revenue, but you're talking $1 billion revenue stream.
yeah, like
And
it's a huge chunk of money. Yeah.
one, I mean, I don't know how they would work that into the existing fiscal guardrails and the spending cap, but also,
Hmm.
we can look at pilot, the payment in lieu of tax that I just mentioned, which is
Hmm.
significantly underfunded. Our education expenditures, excess costs, which we just talked about, are underfunded. We can go through this
Yeah.
list of
Yeah, like you said,
where
it's been steady, but like it's never actually been fully funded like it's supposed to be,
it's
right?
never been fully funded. And I think one of the arguments is pay for what you have on the books before you create a new
Hmm.
that we would have to do. So, it was not a fun public hearing, but that's kind of why we're up there.
Yeah.
That we have concerns that the state's not going to meet its commitment. If you were to take on $1 billion revenue stream, and are we going to be reimbursed dollar for dollar?
Yeah.
And
Um,
that's what we're seeing too. We're seeing just an erosion in our tax base, our grand
Mm.
list. And part of it, you look at the veterans property tax exemption that's going forward,
Yeah.
coupled with the change in how they assess motor vehicles.
Hmm.
That has wiped out any kind of grand list growth just because of the exemption. So,
Yeah.
and then not only that, looking at going back to education again, there's a hold harmless provision that basically makes sure that whatever the town received in state aid
Hmm.
previous year, they're going to receive it. They've been holding to the same number. I think it's almost 10 years now.
Yeah.
Uh, whose costs haven't gone up over those 10
over
years.
the last 10
But
years. Yeah.
now they're looking to remove that, and that affects 81 communities. And so those are some of the fights that we're fighting on behalf of our members.
Yeah. So there's obviously other stuff going on other than just the property tax and taxes. One thing that I was paying attention to was street takeovers. What was going on? What's going on with that stuff?
Yeah, the bill going forward, it's on the Senate calendar. Actually, the Senate passed. It's on the House calendar now.
Hmm.
Basically, would give more teeth and ability for municipalities to kind of uh, handle those kind of situations and
Hmm.
have real penalties that would impact the people that are doing the takeovers or riding their ATVs illegally.
Yeah. So for
And
anyone that doesn't pay attention or doesn't live in a town where this happens, this is where, you know, dozens to hundreds of motorcyclists and ATV riders go out on the street in force and kind of take over the street so that regular people can't get through.
it's very dangerous.
Yeah, it's very dangerous, and then they do like burnouts and like it's stuff that should not be done in the street.
They, there was a video last week where I think I forgot what community it was, but they were jumping on a police vehicle, and it's a scary situation.
Yeah,
Someone's gonna get
it's
hurt.
almost a riot half the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of these people also, I know when they have these big ones, at least when I'm in New Haven, down here, they say that a lot of people aren't even from New Haven. They're coming from
Correct.
out of town, even out of state sometimes to go to these events that they're talking about on social media. So these are big things. This isn't just some local kids that we're talking about.
As I said, it gives
Yeah.
our ability to crack down municipalities, and we anticipate that it will pass the House and be signed by the governor.
Yeah, there's something in there to try to like maybe impound some of the vehicles when this
Correct.
happens and stuff. Yeah.
Pound and crush.
Yeah, because
Pound and
currently it's
crush.
like, they get a ticket, but then they can like get their bike back more or less, right?
Well, you know what happens, the way, they found a loophole, so to speak. You take the vehicle and then you go to the auction, they just buy it back.
Buy your own motorcycle back at the police auction. Yeah, that's wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it sounds like they're almost going like the route of like where they do the gun buybacks and they melt them down sort of thing rather than
Correct.
they get them out of circulation.
Very, very good analogy.
Yeah. So what else is going on? What's big news in, let's talk about housing. What's going on in housing?
Housing. Well, right now we're knee deep in that one. We've the House Democrats, led by Majority Leader Rojas, are putting
Hmm.
together an omnibus housing bill, and we're trying to work through that. We're trying to find the latest copy of it so we can, make
Hmm.
suggestions, recommendations. Look at stuff that maybe we're opposed to, support, and try to work through the issues so we have a workable bill.
Hmm.
Um, at this juncture, we anticipate any day, hopefully getting the ability to do that. And then going forward, I just want to point out a couple things. Uh, our members have weighed in on fair share. We're very concerned about this. It is
Okay.
moving in the right direction. They did get rid of the ability for developers and certain nonprofits to sue
Okay.
municipalities if they didn't think that they were moving forward on the housing allocations that have been determined by a report that was just released yesterday, as a matter of fact,
Okay.
which would be substantial. It would be about 120,000 units. 100,000 of them would be for those who make 30% of the area median income,
Hmm.
which is there a need? Yes, we don't think it's as expansive as that.
Yeah.
But to do that, you also need heavy subsidies for the individual moving in. But
Hmm.
also the developers could do it today with the 830G law.
Yeah.
So we're trying to impress that upon the different representatives, and hopefully we'll get that message across. There's
Yeah.
some other components. I know the city of Bridgeport has had an issue with minimum parking standards being
Hmm.
removed. So basically, each uh, application for parking would have to be negotiated individually. And,
Okay.
and some people say that, some of the minimum parking standards actually are preventing development. So I think there we might be able to come to a compromise,
Mm.
depending
So
on
is this a case of like
what
people
goes
moving into
forward.
like a downtown area, let's say, and wanting to maybe
It
have
could be
less
actually
parking?
anywhere.
Okay.
It could be residential or office or commercial space or even industrial.
But they're saying that they may not need as much parking as the regulations currently say.
Yeah, they're moving toward the model. Go to your example of the downtown,
Hmm.
where if there's a transit hub and people may
Mm.
not have a car, they're
So this is
arguing
part of the
that we might need.
transit-oriented development sort of
Yeah,
trend or way of doing things is that people come into downtown, whatever, Westport or whatever, via train, and they can walk to that source, so they don't need to park a car.
yeah, and to that point, that's one of the reasons why we've taken issue with the allocations because it doesn't really consider where those transit hubs are.
Yeah.
There's been no conversations with DOT, what their future plans are, what it currently exists, and then
Hmm.
have the housing development around that. As you said, that's a trend. People are looking to move toward downtown centers
Hmm.
and job areas, but the way this is allocated, you could have the town of Union have a certain amount of housing, but there's no jobs located right
Yeah.
there. It might be better suited for, let's say, a Norwich or a Wyndham.
Yeah.
Uh,
So it sounds like a lot of the time when we're talking about these and other like unfunded mandates, at their core, they're not necessarily like a bad idea. It's just the way they're trying to implement them doesn't work. Like, they don't
correct.
account for what it's going to cost the towns or the realities on the ground of how, that there's no one's going to build a big housing unit in Unionville or whatever. Things
Yeah.
like that. It's good intentions when they think of it, but the actual way it works doesn't take into account the realities.
Yeah, and I just want to make one final point on that. One of our recommendations is basically to have the regional COGs, the Council of Governments,
Hmm.
do housing needs assessments. They're boots on the ground
Hmm.
and they have a good feel for their communities and what would work. They know where the infrastructure is as far as water and sewer,
Yeah.
and also those transit hubs we just described. So I think that is an approach that we're going to go move forward with.
Yeah. With the COGS, is that the kind of thing that would be handled on sort of like a county basis in other states?
Correct.
One of these things? Okay. Because we don't have a county system. I know for some things, especially in regards to the federal government, they've been trying to get with a county equivalency or something for the COGS. Is that right?
They actually achieved that a few years ago.
So they can, on
The
some
county
things, can
equivalency that
act
which
like a
helped us
county
with the
would in other
ARPA
states.
funds.
Yeah.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM.
One of the other big issues that we've been dealing with, it's one of the tough issues I think that we're looking at is it's Senate Bill 6 that was recently passed by the Senate, and
Okay.
this would subject municipal park and rec, especially our summer programs,
Hmm.
to state oversight. It would license them by the Office of Early Childhood,
Okay.
and really coming out of an unfortunate, a really ugly situation in Bethany.
Hmm.
With a child abuse, a child abuse arrest.
Yeah.
But what our concern is that the language that was passed in Senate Bill 6 wouldn't have prevented what we saw in Bethany. And the overreaching impact of this would be to really reduce or eliminate a lot of those municipal summer rec programs, which
Yeah.
are really a needed piece of summer childcare. There's certainly
Yeah.
a long time issue that they're working on is what they refer to as childcare deserts in certain parts of the state where people don't have access to summer programs. I know in Bridgeport, the last I saw on their website was to send a student to a Bridgeport municipal summer program is $300 for the summer.
Okay.
Um,
And that's for residents or anybody?
That's I believe that's a Bridgeport resident. There might be a differential rate for and these are the camps that you see, on your town greens, maybe at your town halls, your schools. But the regulations, by going to oversight, it would change our staffing ratios, which would be very difficult to comply with. Especially you would increase the number of 20 and 21-year-olds, which is a very hard demographic to find.
Yeah, because I know I actually participated when I was a teenager in our Parks and Rec summer camp program in my hometown, and I was a camp counselor. I was 16,
Yep.
but I didn't have any, childhood education training or, anything like that. I mean,
And so I mean, we're trying to work with work with members of the House, working with continue to have conversations with the Senate, saying, one of the big pushes we've seen this session is the idea of creating the state to create a $300 million kind of off-budget account to get around the fiscal guardrails,
Mm-hmm.
to create like an endowment, they're referring to it as, but to build out childcare. And if
Mm-hmm.
we're looking at, investing $300 million of state money into creating childcare, why are we going to reduce, quality available childcare that we have now?
Yeah, exactly. We already have this structure here. If we could maybe, help fund it or at least
You know,
prevent,
so,
these
we're
regulations from
looking
making
to
it
see,
harder.
are there opportunities to make, there's always opportunities to have conversations, and
Yeah.
I think we're certainly open to, are there recommendations that we can do that might help? But what they passed just ignored, you know, I think we didn't see any mayors supporting this. We didn't see our
Mm-hmm.
park and rec directors supporting this and saying it's going to have a negative impact.
Yeah.
But sometimes, the public, the media is kind of driving
Mm-hmm.
certain reactions, and we're saying, public policy should be based on what is going to improve the situation, not what feels good. But it can be a tough, in light of these
So
allegations.
when you guys are up there, like right now, we're talking about some things that are coming up that you're still working on lobbying on behalf of. But this one that just passed, when something like this passes, what's your next step? Like, where do you go? Do you get like, oh, we lost it, and you move on, or like, what's the next step after that?
Well, on that bill, because it passed the Senate, it still has to go, it still has to get approved by the House. So
Mm-hmm.
there's another,
So
we have another,
you have work to do at the House.
yep, there's another, it has another vote that it needs to go through.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other pieces of the bill that people are very supportive of. So we're looking to see how we can address the problematic sections,
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully come to a solution, that works for the proponents of the bill in the Senate, that works for our towns and our residents. So, it's a constant conversation, and you're balancing out, how many things you can ask a legislator to vote against something. You only have so many arrows in the quiver.
Yeah.
So it is you're mixing a lot of different issues, and as we get closer to the end of session, people get a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more desperate and trying to force things through, because to change it now, it's going to have to go back to the Senate, and you get at times, well, we're not going to have time to take it back up again. So,
Yeah.
it's we look at the majority leader and the speaker, and then the president of the Senate. Really they're trying to run a railroad right now. They have a lot of trains and not a lot of track.
Yeah.
So it's balancing out where all these things go before the statutory. We end on June 4th at midnight.
Yeah.
And then we still have the budget out there, which is going to be, really the biggest issue for us is where we're going to land on the budget.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to set the tone for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
But we did see movement yesterday. The governor had declared a fiscal emergency.
Okay.
To fund Medicaid. There was a deficiency, and by doing that, it opened up about another through that action.
Mm-hmm.
They provided $300 million for deficit spending for that, but it will actually open up about $600 million in additional spending that they're allowed to do in the biennium.
Okay.
So we're hoping that some of that expanded area, because again, we don't have a revenue problem. It's not it's not like the deficit days where we didn't have the money. We don't have the capacity to spend the money.
Yeah. The structures aren't there. Yeah.
And, so we're looking to, with that additional $600 million in spending that's now available, can we get a little bit more of that relief in some of those priority areas for our municipalities?
Yeah. Brian, we're coming to the end of the session here. You said June 4th is coming up. Is there anything that didn't get done this session that you're thinking we're going to have to tackle again next year?
Well, we're still optimistic on a few of them.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd say, looking at the education funding, I
Mm-hmm.
think, depending on where we land, I think there's still other components of the what we were following, Senate Bill 1511, that we'd like to revisit next year. I
So
think
we've
a
got
lot.
some ground on that, but there's still a lot more to do.
Correct. And I think sometimes, we got to remember that a lot of times Connecticut, most legislatures, I presume, it's incremental change. So sometimes you make your
Steady
case,
habits. Yep.
you try to get a piece of it and you keep going forward. So right now we're going to concentrate on that special ed piece and the foundation grant. The one thing that I failed to mention earlier is that we're also looking at indexing if they don't want to allocate the monies directly this year,
Mhm.
at least maybe put in a indexing the foundation grant. So going forward, it'll increase based on the cost of doing business in Connecticut.
I think
Indexing. Randy, could you just explain indexing quick to me? Like, what
So
does that mean?
basically,
Or Brian?
I forgot the exact number, but let's just say for argument's sake, it's $11,500 per
Mhm.
student.
Okay.
That's the foundation grant. We would say, what, inflationary costs, personnel costs, we're going to increase your funding from that 11.5 by 3.5% next
Mhm.
year. So then it's 800 per student. And
It's
then
tied to a
it's
certain index. Is the idea.
correct. And have it
Gotcha.
go
Okay.
year over year. So then you don't have to come back to it. And I think that's what's happened, is that it's been frozen in time for the last 12 years.
Mhm.
And in the cost of, just how many raises have gone up or
Yeah.
for teachers,
So
energy
the way it is
costs,
right now, it's like
healthcare.
unless you revisit it, it just stays the same. So it could stay the same for a decade, 20 years, however
Yeah,
long.
the only way you change
But if
is
you do
through the
the
statute.
indexing, it would just automatically be set up to keep pace with
That's
inflation
why
or whatever.
when Brian mentioned
Yeah.
that hold harmless piece, you have 81 communities that, because they've had declining student enrollment,
Mhm.
their education the money that they would get under the ECS formula, the education cost sharing, theoretically should go down because it's a lower number of students. But
Mhm.
what are you buying today that you paid the same for 10 years ago?
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to say. And then a lot of times a district might lose 10 students, 12
Mhm.
students over, you know, and, but they're spread out over multiple grades, maybe multiple school buildings.
Mhm.
So even though I'm down 10, 15 students, because they're so spread out, it doesn't allow me to reduce a teacher. So you
Yeah.
might have one
Get
teacher
cut teachers. You can't shut down a school building.
because you went from 19
Yeah.
to 20 to 19 in a particular grade. So that overfunded aspect, no towns are really, are underfunded
Yeah.
based on what their actual costs are. And this would address that issue as well. So we would no longer have just this arbitrary numbers. We've been working towards 10 years phase in of full ECS funding.
Mhm.
We always knew that when we enacted that, by the time we got to that full phase in over 10 years,
Yeah.
that we were going to have to start all over again.
Yeah.
So we're looking for something that's a little bit more dynamic that keeps pace, so we don't have to fight it out on an annual year-to-year basis. Then towns can predict, all
Yeah.
right, this is where my costs are gonna, this is where my education funding should be, and it's not as,
Yeah.
like,
We know that costs increase over the years. It's just how inflation works. So why not
Mhm.
account for that ahead of time instead of having to re-legislate this every couple of years? Yeah.
Correct.
Correct.
All right,
Um,
guys. So final thoughts from either one of you about what people need to know, what's going on in the session.
Well, I'm just going to make a statement, to the extent that your listeners are on, many of our members are going to tune in. I think it's very important just to have your voice heard, make contact with your state rep and state senators to help
Mhm.
influence that legislation. I think, Randy, case in point, with Senate Bill 6, we've had a very good outreach on that from Park and Rec members, but also our local leaders. And we're hoping to do the same with housing and other issues where your voice is influential. And I can't impress upon people enough to do those calls and send those emails and texts because they do make a difference.
yeah, and I think that the last message that I would say is that if we flat fund our municipalities,
Mhm.
that property tax increase. Because as I
Yeah.
said, our costs are rising, and the only place that we have to fund that is through the property tax base. And it's, again, you look at, limited economic growth, high, unaffordability of housing.
Yeah.
It's directly related to those costing, that property tax increase, which is highly regressive.
Yeah.
So when they pass costs down, like the veterans exemption, which, they were very proud of,
Mhm.
towns are then being stuck literally with the bill and figuring out a way to come up and pay for
Because
that.
that bill didn't account for how to pay for that stuff.
And it was widely underrepresented. They thought it was going to be about 1,200 veterans, maybe $4 to $5 million statewide.
Yeah.
We're looking at anywhere from 4 to 5,000 veterans at least.
Mhm.
And the bill is in, the 15, $20 million and rising because there's the parameters that they based it on were inaccurate. So we have people with a $35,000 property tax bill that will be removed.
Mhm. Now, Randy,
And
you are actually a veteran, correct?
Yes.
Would you fit under that category?
No, I am not 100% disabled. I do have a disability rating.
Okay.
So I kind of tell people, I'm like, I'm a disabled veteran, and this bill that you passed will raise my property taxes. So
Yeah.
the number that it will help is outweighed by the number that it's actually
Number of people that it will hurt. Yeah.
we have to pick up the cost. So we're looking at how do we honor the commitment that was made to these 100% permanently and totally disabled veterans, but also in a manner that's affordable for all of our residents. So
yeah,
it's striking a balance, and we're hoping that we'll get some relief on that, going forward. But it's never easy.
Nope. Well, Brian, Randy, thanks for talking with us today. Keep up the good work in the final stretch here, and I hope you have a good vacation in June.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
and we'll
guys.
come back on afterwards to tell you how everything wrapped up.
Sounds good. All right. Take care.
All right,
Thank you. Thank you.
The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry Draws is on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.